Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue our Lightwave 2 Unreal Engine series where we introduce new concepts that may not already be known to most Lightwavers out there. This particular video, you don't necessarily need to be a Lightwaver in order to follow along. The one mesh that we've brought into our game today is actually created within Lightwave, and I created it as a little doodad for a project I had built several years ago. It is just a static mesh object, textured in Substance Painter, much like the robot from previous videos. In fact, it was used in that scene that I originally created that robot for. We also have here the Unreal Engine third-person character. This scene was started from the third-person character template. So when you create a new project in the engine, you have different templates you can choose from. This template was the third-person character blueprint, just so that we had kind of a character that we could just quickly get walking around and all that kind of stuff without having to do any actual work. So what this character will do for us today is it's going to walk into this little volume we have here, and it's going to activate this rotor and start spinning these lights around. So that let's go ahead and go into our game view so you can kind of see what's going on here. These lights here are blueprints currently. I've created a blueprint that I've moved this static mesh into and then attached some lights to it. Let's go ahead and hit play so we can see what happens. Just walk forward. Lights turn on, leave the volume, lights turn off. Alright, sounds pretty simple, right? It kind of is, although, at least at first, you know, the blueprints might seem a little complicated. Just know that Blueprint follows kind of an object-oriented, event-based system. So, you know, just think about, well, I need to trigger this to do that type of thing. So let's go ahead and remove these objects from our scene because we won't be calling them anymore. Let's go ahead and hit delete. So the first thing that we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to create a blueprint in our content browser. So we're going to go ahead and right click, bring up our little menu here. We're going to go blueprint class. Now, we are, for this project, only going to worry about actor classes. We're not going to deal with like characters, you know, driving vehicles, you know, possession, that type of thing. But just know that there are a vast array. These are kind of like most of the ones that you're going to want to use, but we have a vast array of different types of kind of starter blueprint templates here, but for the most part we just need to grab our actor. Pawn is anything that can be possessed or receive input from the character. The character obviously is something that walks around. It's going to deal with state machines and that type of thing. Player controller is basically the interface in which your control inputs will affect a given character or what have you. Game modes basically is a way of telling your map what player character to draw from, any kind of other kind of default settings. Components are components that can be dragged and dropped into something. So theoretically, I could create a actor component and drag it into a mesh, and it will kind of give that mesh blueprint qualities. But we're not going to really worry about that now. I know some people use them more than I do, but you know, I don't use them that often. So let's just go ahead and select our actor, and we're going to call this Rotor Light. It's going to give us a warning that we have a duplicate name, so we're going to want to make sure that we unify or make the name unique, but we're still going to, you know, give it a name similar to you know, what we're going to be referencing here, so that when we drag it into the scene, it's immediately identifiable. So I've gone ahead and opened up our blueprint. By default, it just gives you a kind of a default scene root, so think of it as kind of like a null at the origin. There's also a construction script, and we're not really going to deal too much with the construction script in this particular video, It may be one of the things I save for last. There are some things that will help benefit this particular project that I didn't demonstrate earlier, that uses the construction script for allowing you to expand the shape and size of the trigger that we'll be making. And then here's our event graph where we go ahead and actually execute code. So the first thing that we're going to do, and you'll find right away that Unreal Engine really prefers that you have multiple monitors. I think I currently have 2 monitors. I really feel like I need 4 when using Unreal Engine, but you know, we'll get by, especially since we can only capture to 1 screen at the moment anyway. So we're going to head and grab our rotor light from our content browser, and we're just going to drag it into our components list. So by default, it just appears right at its origin. That's because the model has the origin correctly placed, and that's going to be something that you're going to want to keep in mind when creating your assets. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our add components. You know what, before we do that, let's just go ahead and compile this. And we're going to grab our blueprint and drag it into the level. And we're just going to select game view, just so that we don't have any of the little doodads and stuff kind of blocking our view of what this does. Basically, I just want to show this update as we build this blueprint. So we're going to go ahead and add a spotlight. And with this spotlight selected, we're going to give it a light color, and this time we're going to make it red just to try to match this this glass piece on our light. And we're going to bring its intensity up to about 3 times what the default is, just so that we can really see it. As you can see, this spotlight has parented itself to our rotor light because we had a rotor light selected. If we had a default scene light or default scene root, it would have just kind of put it, you know, within the same kind of hierarchy. So it would be basically like a brother to a rotor light, but we really need it, and we can just reparent it by dragging and dropping it. So if you didn't have your rotor light selected when you did this, this is how we're going to make sure that our spotlight is actually parented to our rotor light mesh. Now we're just going to grab the transform handles here, and as you can see, it's updating over here as I move this thing. And we're just going to try to position it so that it looks like our light is emitting from the actual shape of the light mesh itself. We're just going to compile that for safety. Hit save as we go. And now we're going to right click on our spotlight and we're going to hit duplicate. And so it's going to give us a second spotlight right in the same place as the first one. Occasionally, if something is offset from its origin, sometimes in previous versions of the engine, I don't know if it does it in this version or not, it would actually offset that again from the origin, but I don't think it's doing that right now, and I'm not sure if that's something that's been resolved or what, but just know I've had that issue in the past. It doesn't seem to be a problem here. And so now that we have our lights more or less positioned where we want them, we can always change them later. This whole process is non-destructive, so you can always go back and make changes. We'll compile that, save. Now we want to have this rotor light actually animate when the level is active, when the game is executing. So let's go to our event graph. There's some starter events. Unreal Engine's blueprint is a event-based scripting solution, so code is executed when it is triggered to do so by an event. So by default, you have your event begin play, you have your event actor begin overlap. We will be using kind of a brother node to this later in the other blueprint that we're going to be creating, but in this particular blueprint, all we're going to worry about is the event tick. Now, what the event tick is basically a trigger event that happens every single time Unreal Engine draws a frame while it's executing. Now, normally, if I were doing a game, I wouldn't build this particular component this way. The rotor light would have been a skeletal mesh with an animation that's already built in. Using event tick in this case is less efficient than we'd necessarily want it for a full game. Although I did want to show it, and I want to show that, because we had already shown animation in a previous video, how to create, or one of the ways we can create animation within Blueprint without any skeletal meshes or animation assets. All we're going to be doing is taking our rotor light itself and just rotating it a certain amount over every frame so the animation is smooth. There are plenty other of events within Blueprint. One of the most common events that you're probably going to use, although we won't be using them in this video, are custom events. Custom events are, you need to create an event that doesn't have a regular kind of trigger, so you're doing something that will fire off a custom event or something like that. You can go ahead and right click, start typing custom, and one of the first things that's highlighted here is add custom event. And you can then name the event and fire stuff off that way. Custom events don't happen on tick, but you can create like repeat functions and have them trigger off timelines, which are a Blueprint executable way of telling something that is happening over time. Again, we're not going to be using that here, so we're going to go ahead and delete that. And all we're really going to worry about is our event tick in this particular Blueprint. But before we worry too much about that, what we need is to create a variable that represents the rotation of our object, of our light. So we're going to go ahead and hit the plus variable button, and we're going to call this rotation. Now, by default, Blueprint has given us a Boolean variable, and we're going to need to change this to a rotation variable. All a Boolean variable is a true or false statement. So in Unreal Engine and we'll be talking a bit more about this later, is basically it's a way to branch code. So whether you do a check if it's the correct thing that you wanted to detect or not, you can say, does this equal that? And if that's true, code executes one way. If it's false, code can execute another way, or you just let it fail and die there and then nothing happens. But let's go ahead and click on the red little capsule icon next to the variable, and we're going to select rotator. Just to kind of go over here, these are kind of like the ones you're going to use the most. I typically use like floats and integers a lot, Booleans obviously, rotators, transforms, and vectors, strings occasionally, getting names, and that kind of stuff. We'll be dealing with some of that as we go once we start talking about tags. But now that we have our rotation variable created, we're going to select it, and you can see under default value, which is going to be something we're going to deal with a lot here. It's going to tell you to please compile the Blueprint. So let's go ahead and compile, and now it gives us access to the values within that variable. So we have X, Y, and Z. Right now, all we're going to worry about is our Z, which is our yaw in Unreal Engine, heading in Lightwave terms. So I'm just going to go ahead and set that to 15 for default so that it has something. We're going to go ahead and drag that into the world, and each variable has two states. It's either a get state or a set state. So think of it like read and write. For now, we're just going to get our rotation, and gives us this kind of, again, capsule icon. But if we were to go ahead and get a set state, it gives us this larger box, and we can directly input stuff into there, or we can directly plug that into there, depending on what we want. So basically, this is how we write to a variable, and this is just how we reference what is stored in that variable. Get rid of that. We're going to grab our rotor light mesh from our components list, and we're going to drag that into here. And again, this is like a get function here. It's going to be a reference to this, and from here we're just going to drag off from the pin, and we're going to start typing add ROT, and we're going to get a add relative rotation. And from our event tick, we can just plug that in to there, and from our rotation, we can just plug that into there. And because I am absolutely obsessive compulsive about organizing my blueprints, I will just kind of neaten this up just a little bit. And we're going to hit compile. Because all we're doing is looking at this light, we don't want to change our camera position just yet. I'm just going to click on this little arrow drop down and hit simulate. And that you can see now we have a light that rotates around. Obviously, because the inner piece is the same part of the same mesh as the outer piece will rotate with it. In this particular scenario, that doesn't matter. If you're doing a game, maybe you would want to break that up. And again, I would always recommend using a skeletal mesh in this scenario, but This again is just so that we can show code and how to animate stuff just using code. So we're going to go ahead and stop that. Now, before we move on, again, the goal is to have these lights turn on and off as the character overlaps a collision object. And so what we're really going to want to do here is we're going to kind of create some space here. And this is where we're going to start talking about our Boolean variables just a little bit. So from our execution pin here, we're going to drag off a line there, and we're going to let go, and it's going to automatically bring up our search for variable actions. And we're just going to start typing branch. Alright, so what we have created here is basically just a Boolean function. So it's going to tell us whether what we're trying to do is true or false. And we're going to need a condition to determine that. So we're going to drag a pin off here. We're going to let go. And if you have context sensitivity turned on, which is usually what you want to do, but there are times where you're going to want to turn it off, you're going to want to go ahead and select promote to variable. And that's just another way of creating a variable. So we're going to click that, and it's automatically going to create a variable in here, and we're just going to call this can rotate. And because we're asking a question that this variable will answer for us, I put a question mark. You don't need to, I just do. It tells you what your statement is that you're trying to make here, what you're trying to determine here. Can it rotate? Condition. Again, once we have this selected, it's going to tell us what our default value is, and because we haven't compiled, it's going to tell you to compile. All right, and all this is a true or false statement, which is represented by a checkbox. And so by default, I'm going to leave that off. And I'm going to hit simulate again. As you can see, nothing happens. Stop the simulation. Make sure that is selected. If we're going to tell it to yes, it can rotate, we're going to hit compile, and we're going to go ahead and simulate again. And so that is how you will control whether or not this light rotates or not. And so this is pretty simple, right? So it's just a few nodes, and we're going to now build another blueprint that we can use to trigger this or not. However, before we get into that, I want to talk about exposing variables to the level, so that any copies you create of this can have different settings, so to speak. So let's just go ahead and select our rotation variable. Now, if you remember, by default we have it set to 15. And if we want to expose this so that we can change that number per instance of the blueprint, we will be able to do that. We can also do this with can rotate, although we won't be doing that necessarily in every case as we go. But as you can see here under default, and of course you can give these variables custom categories here. But under default, we have our number 15. So let's turn this down to, say, 5 and hit simulate. Nothing happened because we have our default variable turned off. All right. Let's go ahead and select this again. This time we're going to trigger it up here, and now it rotates, and it's rotating at a slower rate. Say I wanted it to rotate the other direction, I put a negative in front of the 5. Again. Now it's rotating the other direction. Say I want to duplicate this. Now if I hold down the right Alt button and select the direction and drag, it creates a duplicate. So it's a very quick way of creating another instance of a blueprint. All right, now hit simulate, and they're both turning at the same rate, same direction. However, say we didn't necessarily want that. Maybe we wanted this back to 15, or maybe we want to make it 30. Go ahead and simulate. Now it's going the other direction at a different speed. And basically what this enables is the individual artist or whoever to determine some settings, some default settings for that particular instance of that particular item. Go ahead and hit stop. Deselect can rotate. And now that one doesn't rotate and this one does. So that's just a way of creating controls that are both accessible by the blueprints, but also by the user at can be runtime or prior to runtime, just to quickly access functions that you can expose to just a level artist who may not know blueprints, right? So if you have a team and you have one blueprint guy, but that blueprint guy has to make tools for all the other artists who are building levels and stuff in the scene, that's how you do that. Because if you're not familiar with blueprints, you might not know that, oh, I need to change this variable or what have you. But it's also important to do this if you want to make instance modifiable attributes. Not dissimilar to how material instances work, where you're exposing parameters, you're exposing variables essentially to the child material, to the instance material. And so that's all we're doing here. And it's pretty cool that you can do that. It enables quite a bit. That is going to be the end of this part in the Blueprint series. The next video is going to pick up where we create our trigger volume and tell it to interact with our warning light. However, we're going to stop the video here. In the next video, we're going to set up our trigger volume and have it communicate with our lights, so that our character can then overlap that trigger and turn the lights on and off depending whether it's overlapping on the object or not. So thank you all for watching. Please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye.